apologize for my strong Czech accent, which is something I cannot do a thing with, reaching the 60th year of my existence. It won't improve at the moment. Second, I need to apologize for my English, which is not that fluent anymore because I don't use it, especially in this COVID time, of course. I'd like to spend 90 minutes with you today doing some sort of talking first for 60 or 70 minutes and then leaving some space for your inquiries, questions, responses, doubts, or whatever. When it comes to the topic of contemporary Czech literature, however, it's not your business to care for Czech literature, okay? But at the same time, you invested some amount of your lifetime to come to Prague, Czech Republic, and that's why I believe it might be interesting to you, at least partially, to be exposed a little bit to the local context, okay? And that's why I will focus mainly not on some sort of exposure of hundreds of pieces of Czech contemporary novels, short stories, etc., but more generally on the position of writers within the context of Czech literature, making two essential points when it comes to the context. First, Czech literature is something they call minor literature or small literature, which is not particularly interesting from the point of reading, because we do read books and we don't have to care where they come from, if they make sense and so on. Okay. But from the point of the writers, it means a lot, and I'll explain at least partially. And second point I want to make is trying to explain that the mechanisms which rule contemporary Czech literature in the Czech or more generally in the European context work much more differently than the American situation, because they are much more wrapped in historical continuity. That the influence or the connection between the past on the one hand and the present is much more striking, as you might have noticed, in our mentality, but also in the way we handle things, using always this kind of attitude, why should we change the approach? We used to do it this way all the time before. So there is this amount of conservatism and something, the impact of the past on the present, which I will hopefully illustrate as well. Exposing the whole topic via something we might call the rules of the game. I'll try to describe a little bit the context of contemporary Czech literature. From the economic point of view, it's a relatively large business in the Czech context. Okay, people spend on average $400 million annually buying books. Okay, it's less than 1% of this what do you call it? This gross average income when it comes to the state, but still it's relatively big business. But at the same time, literature has strikingly small social impact. Okay, if you open contemporary Czech printed newspapers or these essential websites offering new news, just occasionally and rarely you notice something you might call a review of some book which is published. We might spend time talking about the reasons. Okay? One reason, obviously, is that in the era which focuses on the eventfulness, literature simply fails, even in terms of the broader context of culture, because it lacks this aspect of the event. Okay? The event is when an author dies, or something like that, or kills someone, or whatever. Okay? The whole process of publishing the book is a continuous event with no, it's a continuous process with no striking event, as you know, in contrast to a concert of a rock group or to an opening evening of an artistic exhibition or something like that. So that might be one reason, but there will be even other. And one of them is that people stop caring about literature, which is again kind of historical story that I will explain later on. But the recent situation is that according to the sociological polls, just 1/4, just 25% of the whole population reads books. In terms of something you might call regular reading, opening or touching the book at least once per week, okay? More than 50% claim they read books occasionally once per year or something like that, which I assume is much more this psychological response not to admit I never read the whole book, because once you go deeper and inquire what some title they read in recent years, these people usually cannot offer you a title or appearance of the book or whatever. So here we're talking just about 25% inside of the population of 10 million people. Okay, so we are talking about something like 2 million people, more or less. And here comes the first important difference and feature of minor literature, like Czech literature. And that's the feature that numbers work differently here. What we call, for more than 20 years, a bestseller is a book which publishes over 5,000 copies. 5,000 copies is a best-selling book, meaning that on average these books sell 500 copies. Okay, and that's the other thing. I had the PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately the projector isn't working, so I cannot share the numbers, and that's why I do apologize just for bringing some numbers which are difficult to digest. But the contrast is that, as I was saying, we have a very large book market. In Czech Republic, on average, they publish 17,000 books per year, okay, which is quite a big number. But at the same time, as I'm saying, these books on average sell 500 copies, okay, which has some consequences. First of all, even a best-selling status doesn't mean that you can be a freelance writer. Because selling 5,000 books of your new novel is not giving you the living for 2 or 3 years when you come to the next book, okay? So there are some consequences of this situation. You have to read more, okay? Just 5 or 10,000 copies is not enough to grant you some comfortable living, and that's why there is this kind of space you want to reach to go to numbers like 50,000 books, which gives you a perfect living. This space, in the small context, is very limited. It can contain something like 5 to 10 contemporary prose fiction writers who occupy such a space and who manage to sell books in such an amount. Okay. And otherwise, you have to depend on something. And you're in this dependent position. One key influence and dependence which can improve your status is movie adaptations. Well, being lucky and having your novel adapted into a movie, okay, which of course increases, as you might assume, the future selling of your book. And the second option you have is to rely on translations, okay, because the particular Czech situation is relatively bad, not just because of the case of the small population of Czechs, but also because of the fact that there is no other country they would speak Czech. Okay, publishing in English, you can sell some books in Canada, Australia, South Africa, whatever. Here, you need to focus either on the local market or you depend merely on translation. As I was saying, there are 17,000 books published per year, but at the same time, we have just a few big players in terms of the publishers. Okay, we have just 8 publishing houses that publish over 200 books per year. Otherwise, it's all small publishing. Under communists, and that's the point I'm starting to begin, I will go on to compare the communist situation and the post-communist situation, which unfortunately lasts until these days. Under communists, we had just something like 25 or 30 large publishing houses, or owned by the state or by some institutions and so on, and all specializing on one particular item of production. One publishing house publishing just translations from the Western world, the other publishing house publishing translations just from the Soviet Union, okay. The third house publishing mature writers or well-known writers, the fourth one publishing young and relatively unknown writers, and this kind of specialization. After the collapse of communism in 1989, this situation, of course, collapsed as well. And instead of these large publishing houses, we have more than 3,000 private publishers of the small type. And this kind of smallness is again important and meaningful or impactful in a way that being a publisher who publishes 8 books per year, you do it more or less of your own, okay? Hiring an editor occasionally or whatever. And you don't have any PR, you don't have any influence of the media and so on. So using your own abilities, you publish, print the book and deliver it to distribution. And that's all, okay. Which has, again, an impact on the book market, of course, because then one of these big publishers, say, when they buy these global literary stars like Mrs. Rowling or Paulo Coelho or something like that, they also buy the whole promotion campaign, okay, all these strategies and so on, and that's why they, in a way, wipe out the whole market, okay, they occupy all the key positions using the promotions and so on. The impact of this situation is as follows, okay. Once you have a manuscript and you start approaching publishers, sooner or later you will find the publisher, okay? It's highly improbable. Even the most obscure manuscripts are published, okay? Because sooner or later, simply one of these small publishers decides to run the risk, which is the first option, or second and more probable option, to apply for some support publishing, okay? Which is the other controversial thing. Having such problems with the whole book market, the state intervenes and you can apply to the Ministry of Culture to get support for your book, which sounds excellent. And there is around, say, 300 or 400 books per year which are supported. Okay. But at the same time, because the support covers all the costs, the publisher again wouldn't care for anything else than to publish the book, because once you have all your costs covered, you don't have to sell even 200 books, if you understand, okay? Because if you don't sell one book, you're still on zero. You didn't lose any money, okay? So it's kind of problematic situation, which again brings big advantage to the relatively well-known writers, because applying for such a support means that you're offering your CV or the CV of the writer and some sort of synopsis. But as you know, all the synopses look more or less the same, okay? Some story about love, hatred, and the fact they're going to die, or something like that. And because of that, these commissions or committees that decide on support, they simply distinguish just according to the names of the writers, okay? So it's highly discriminating for newly emerging writers. And at the same time, it's very safe for writers who already published, say, 5, 7 novels. Once you publish 30 novels, it's too much, okay, because they feel that you already have gotten enough space and so on. But it's again some feature which looks okay, but at the same time, which might be problematic. Why is the whole situation stuck so much? Here we have to reach the other historical reasons. We had communism here and communist rule for 40 years. And in terms of culture, they constructed some sort of isolation, which is not exactly splendid isolation, but which offered you some cultural products, local story, novels or films or sometimes even comics and so on, and some translations, especially from the Soviet Union and the other communist countries, okay? It is no big fun. And because of that, in communist time, people read literature quite extensively. It is the most obvious way of escape you could use, and this kind of escapist reading was the reason, okay? Because you're exposed to the world which works differently, which has the other rules, mechanisms, values, whatever. And that's why those days people would spend their time, as I'm saying, reading, okay, having the effect that, say, in the 1980s, the last decade of communism, if you published a contemporary Czech novel, some average novel, it would on average sell 10,000 copies, which economically already works, okay, it's a profitable thing. And sometimes, of course, you will reach 100,000 copies and so on. The reason is that we had here some translations, they're saying, and sometimes even translations from the Western fiction, that all genres, and especially what you call genre literature, was eliminated. We had just the classical detective stories, Agatha Christie and this kind of stuff, Sherlock Holmes, okay. But no contemporary crime novels, thrillers, or whatever. Fantasies were limited. The Lord of the Rings has been published for the first time after the collapse of communism and so on, and the whole genre was unknown here. And here we are already reaching one effect which came with the collapse of communism. All of a sudden, these translations of this genre fiction translation into Czech emerged, and people were just shocked and immensely pleased, okay, because you discovered something completely new, be it science fiction, be it fantasy, or be it thrillers, or whatever, okay. But at the same time, it's even more complicated, because not only these people would cover the recent production, but you needed to read it all back, all these decades before the production you didn't have access to. To give you one illustration, 1996, the first James Bond film arrived into Czech movie theaters, GoldenEye, sorry. But it was James Bond number 16, and the viewers were just amazed how great it is on the big screen and so on. But at the same time, the next impulse was to go to a VCR rental store and to rent all the previous 15 James Bond films. Okay, so here came this kind of change of the behavior. Okay, because you not only wanted to see what's going on right now in this forbidden Western world, but you needed also to cover all the past. You needed to watch all the films with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which were, for some mysterious reason, also banned in communist Czechoslovakia and so on. So that was the first shift which happened, okay. Instead of reading contemporary Czech prose fiction, these people switched to reading translations and to reading all this gorgeous genre stuff they couldn't experience before. The second switch came hand in hand with that. You had the feeling that you spent some years or decades reading fiction, and it didn't help you at all, because all of a sudden you're living in a new society, in a society of capitalism. You don't know how to handle and how to live under communist times. You came to a grocery store and there were two types of yogurt. The blueberry yogurt, the strawberry yogurt. So you picked up the one according to the flavor you prefer. All of a sudden, you came in 1993, 1994 into a supermarket or a hypermarket, and there would be 200 brands of yogurt, which is demanding and confusing, at least at the beginning. Okay? Because you don't know how to behave, and you don't want to spend hours reading all the instructions and amounts of the artificials and so on. And that might be some sort of metaphoric illustration of the whole switch. And all of a sudden, as I'm saying, literature seemed to fail, because all this literature, this is formally published and read, talked about communist system, communist ways of living, and so on. So it felt all of that like being in a museum when reading this literature. And here the other thing happened, because of the communists, there were hundreds of writers who were banned, either because they lived in emigration in Western Europe, which meant the betrayal of the country or so on, but even the dissidents who stood here, but they were not allowed to publish. And more or less all the 1990s, the book production was just the production of this formally banned literature, which is very important from the moral point of view, okay? Something which is formally prohibited and prescribed, that is brought to the spotlight. But at the same time, even this type of banned literature, like the pieces of Václav Havel, Milan Kundera, and so on, they talked again about living in communism. And people in the 1990s had the feeling, thanks God, communism is over. So why should I read about that? Who cares anymore? And that brought all that production as if into the museum and changed the reading preferences, because all of a sudden the ratio of fiction dropped down radically. And the communists, more or less half of all the production of books was fiction. Okay. Since the end of 1990s, it's less than 25%. Okay, so it's disappearance of fiction generally. And the other feature I mentioned before, even having the amount of fiction, it's not anymore, say, half Czech and half translated fiction, but it's 4/5 of fiction which is translated mostly from English, but also from the other big languages. Because with big languages, it's again easier for publishers to behave economically. You have hundreds of translators who are ready to translate from English. And that's why you can choose the cheapest one, or you can put the pressure to lower the salaries and so on. Once you have a translator, say, from Danish or Swedish literature, there are just 2 or 3 in this country, and that's why you cannot do this. Which has the other striking effect that we have such a big amount of translations in contemporary Czech book market, but at the same time, it's translations just from 3 or 4 dominating languages. Okay, English, German, Spanish, French, and that's about all. Okay. Otherwise, when you want to publish, say, a Swedish novel, well, Swedish novel, of course, it's crime stories itself, well, these days, but say a contemporary novel from the Netherlands, you need again to get some financial support. So otherwise, it's just a kind of domination. So to return back to the point I wanted to make, people stopped reading fiction generally because they had the feeling that it talks about some forgotten past and so on. And instead of fiction, those who read on, they focused on non-fiction. This kind of new feeling that finally they are not lying to you. It's just facts, okay? Be it autobiographical genres like journals, memoirs, but be mostly this kind of books like the history of potatoes, or the history of brewing beer, and so on, okay? Because that in a way enlightens your life, because having again the same potatoes for lunch today, all of a sudden it feels different because it's rich with all this knowledge that you just gathered from the book and so on. Okay, so that's something. One thing I need to mention which added to the whole situation was the economic aspect, because under communists, books were not taxed at all. The state supported, like beer is not taxed here as well, because communists were happy when people were drinking because they wouldn't care for the politics and so on. Okay. The same with books. In 1990s, with the collapse of communism, not only books were taxed regularly, which meant partial increase of the price, but also the whole printing industry changed with the arrival of the computers. Okay. And here it had a big economic effect because Czech printing houses all of a sudden realized that they don't have to print just the Czech production using these diacritic markers that we have in Czech and so on. Once you get a PDF that you're going to put into the machine, it can be in English, in Spanish, in Chinese, or whatever, and you're just printing the book here, okay? Which of course meant the big increase of prices. The prices of books jumped from 80 crowns in 1993 to more than 200 crowns in the 2000 years. Okay, in 7 years, it's something like 140% increase, caused by this fact that all of a sudden, you're using international prices. Okay, because it doesn't matter if you're printing a Czech book or a Chinese book. Okay, the increase of printing eventually increased the books. Next, the price of the books. Next, one more feature, and that was the collapse of the bookstores. Because with the collapse of communism, they came the so-called privatization, returning properties back to their original pre-communist owners. Okay. But the problem obviously is that you were returning these properties to the grandsons and granddaughters of the original owners. And the original owners knew how to handle such a big rental house like on the other side of the square. But the grandchildren, they wanted to use the cheapest way or to get rid of that. And one effect was that they would fire bookstores because it's small profit they can offer you with rents. Okay? And everyone had the idea that if you fire a bookstore and if you open a pizza place there, you're going to increase the rents 10 times and so on. So the effect was that even the towns and cities of 20,000 people in 2 or 3 years lost the 2 or 3 bookstores they had. And then had one more important consequence. All these publishers were producing books, but because of the loss of bookstores, you didn't have places to sell these books. Okay, all the book market got stuck in the middle of 1990s, and the solution came, but highly problematic. There appeared something called Levné knihy, the new chain of these discounted bookstores, which is something you have in America or anywhere else, of course. But the difference was that this chain was not selling the books with 20-30% discount, but they were selling the books for 20 or 30% of the original price. Okay, because all the publishers, having no chance to distribute and sell books, felt lucky and happy to sell the books to this chain, to sell it almost for zero, just to get rid of the amount of thousands of books. Okay. And that had, again, a very big psychological effect. Because once you, and these discounted bookstores were everywhere, okay, on each street at the end of 1990s. And that's why once you entered and you saw that the book you wanted to buy now costs just 20% of the original price, you changed your behavior. Why did you buy it for the original price? It's just the matter of waiting half a year and you get it with big discounts, so it feels even better. Okay, because again, under communists, we didn't have any discounts. Okay, all prices were regular and the same in all places. Like a mug of beer would cost the same amount in all pubs, and that's why even this feature of something on sale was immensely heavy and productive psychologically, as you can imagine, okay, because it's a miracle, okay. All of a sudden, it's just half the price, I need to have it, okay. So this kind of thing. Let me proceed from this context to the new situation. Hand in hand with that came something you might call the changing of the guards or changing of the generations, because Czech literature and Czech prose fiction is particularly lucky to have the big generation of writers like Milan Kundera, Bohumil Hrabal, Josef Kowarski, Václav Havel, Arnošt Lustig, and so on. People who emerged through 1960s, through the most liberating decade of communism, and who were, first of all, excellent writers, and second, also kind of big stars, okay, selling translation. I mean, they starred on balls. In 1990s, these people were simply old, okay, beyond the horizon. They either stopped writing like Václav Havel, or they switched to the other languages like Milan Kundera, who stopped writing in Czech and began writing in French, saying that he wouldn't allow the translation into Czech by anyone else than himself, and he had no time to do these translations. So paradoxically, this new fiction of Kundera is accessible even to Chinese people in the Communist Republic of China, but not to the Czech people, okay, because no one was allowed to translate him, as I'm explaining. The effect is that this generation simply disappeared, and at the same time, no new generation stepped in to take on and behave the same way. Okay? Literature, by this role, lost the original prestige because, of course, novels and short stories were published on, but all of a sudden, by these no-name writers, by these writers who are just mere writers, people who put down letters, okay? While the previous generation, they could offer you these big stories of being persecuted by the regime, being in prison, or whatever, okay? They truly functioned like stars even on the book covers, okay? Putting some little story out of their CVs. While these new writers, they simply were born, they started writing, and so on, okay? The boring thing. So that was the other feature. I think finally reach or move from the context to the text. So this is the situation what I was trying to explain up till now. And then what do we have? That's my attempt to characterize the production, okay, to divide it into, say, 5 dominant clusters or segments or whatever. And you look at the contemporary Czech fiction, the dominating in terms of numbers, but also in terms of social impact, is the segment you might call mid-brow novels. This term means something coined by Umberto Eco to fit in between the traditional binary opposition, highbrow literature, Joyce, Woolf, etc., and lowbrow literature, trash, and this kind of stuff. Okay. And Eco in the 60s tried to promote something which would stay in between. It wouldn't be trash, but at the same time, it wouldn't be experimental, demanding, and so on. And this is a new phenomenon which recently rules the Czech literature. We have something you might call social novels, which sell 100,000 copies, 150,000 copies, and so on. It's the production, interestingly enough, produced mostly by female writers, okay, which is the other striking difference, because under communist literature is immensely patriarchal. 90% of all writers were males, okay. All of a sudden, we have the reverse. We have more female than more male writers, generally. And second, it's mostly the female writers who succeed, because they fit this mid-brown novel cluster. Okay? What I mean is the type of novel which gives you this traditional feeling that they constructed in your mind in a school, that the novel should educate you, should tell you something about the world. And that's why these novels usually talk about the past. Okay? It's usually 2 or 3 generation stories, the grandparents experiencing the Second World War, the parents experiencing communism, and then the third step, the young generation who lives in these post-communist times. And it gives you just very banal exposure to what it meant during the occupation or during communism. But still, it gives you this kind of feeling that you're learning something. It's not just waste of time. It's serious. Okay? If you read Harry Potter or Twilight or this kind of stuff, you have this guilty pleasure feeling, okay, that you're wasting your time. Well, these novels offer you the feeling that it's elevating my knowledge, and at the same time, the essence of these novels are stories about relationships, okay. Dark sides of the newly emerging past, okay. Parents behaving in a bad way under communists, and now, finally, how to handle the situation, how to live with the guilt of my parents who sent a person to prison or something like that, okay? But as I'm saying, the essence are relationships, so family relationship, raising up children, and so on, dealing with drugs and the other contemporary problems. Then, of course, the love and hate relationships and so on. These novels work differently in contrast to Joyce, Kafka, or whatever, because they don't frustrate you at all. Once you start reading Joyce for the first time, it's just a mere frustration, and it starts making sense once you have enough of something you might call literary competence. Okay? You know how to handle the editing, the fragments, the partial or fragmented nature of the novel, and so on. Okay? Well, these novels allow you to start with zero, okay, with no reading experience. And that's the reason I believe for the success, because they not only these novels allow the accessibility, but also the authors were the first generation to approach the new media. Okay. Most of these authors, the connection between the success of the novel, the best-selling status of the novel, and the active position of the writer from Facebook to YouTube or whatever is more or less clear. Okay. And paradoxically, though these novels don't have any particular, say, historical, developmental value or aesthetic value, they manage to bring people back to reading, okay, because they manage to run a more or less coherent campaign that reading is trendy. You look good with that book, and so on, okay. 10 years ago, when I visited Paris, I was amazed riding the metro to see in each car 8, 10 people reading books, reading the classics, okay, Flaubert, Zola, Balzac, and so on. You even, watching this, you have the suspicion that it's the part of the plotting of some sort of tourist industry image. These people are paid to carry the books, okay, to construct the image of Paris as the intellectual city. Here, you would notice all the people in metro staring at their mobile phones. Nowadays, it's quite different. Using the metro, even here, you might see these good-looking young people who hand the book and they're ready to take a selfie each time. I look good with my book. Okay. It's cheap, it's trendy, but at the same time, it works. Okay, because these activities, of course, develop into the big impact of all these reading databases like Goodreads and so on. And once the book is approved by this broad public audience, it very quickly reaches the status of something which sells 100,000 copies and so on. Okay, so that's the dominating genre. Okay, the genre which recently is still broadening, but at the same time, as I'm saying, as it's fashionable, it's just a question of time and it stops to be fashionable. Okay, then instead of wearing a book, it will be fashionable to wear a racket on your shoulder or something like that. Okay, that's, as I'm saying, the dominating genre, and of course, each publisher, and that's the effect, each publisher wants to give a try. Okay, you're a newly emerging writer, and it's kind of boring story you put into the manuscript. But what if you join this circle? What if you manage? Okay, and that's why publishers are immensely willing, okay, to give a try and to publish one or two books. If you fail, even with the second book, then the game is over for you. Okay, but there are big chances if the manuscript has these features of the mid-brow, okay, being accessible and being, as I'm saying, self-explanatory. For these books, you don't have to have any larger cultural encyclopedia and so on. But at the last point, these books don't translate well at all. As they emerged, even international publishers thought that it was an interesting phenomenon. All of a sudden, they sell 200 copies of the book here, so let's give it a try and let's translate it into English. But these books fail in translation because simply they assume the type of local readership. They work with something you would call local cultural encyclopedia. Okay, they assume that you know these essential features that the namesake of Stalin or local communist leader Pan Gottwald gives you some essential information without a footnote or whatever. Okay, these books simply rely on the context, say, that you get here from an average high school, I would say. And with people who don't possess this context, it's just very boring stuff. Let's move to the other segment. As I mentioned, I didn't have any particular type of genre fiction on the communists. And even in the 1990s, it was still considered like something, primitive, cheap, and this kind of stuff. But the situation is again changing, and one of the key role leaders who changed the situation is Karol Sidon, who is an 80-year-old rabbi for more than 20 years, the rabbi of Prague and now the rabbi of Czechia, who is something like 7 years ago, sat in his office, and he, instead of behaving like a proper rabbi and caring for the community, he spent time writing a gorgeous tetralogy which mixes up science fiction, fantasy, crime novels, political thrillers of the Dan Brown type, and so on. And he put down 2,000 pages of this tetralogy. Okay. He published it under a pen name to avoid this kind of scandal that instead of being a rabbi, he is a commercial prose fiction writer. But the pen name was discovered within 10 days or so. So now he admits he is the author. And this is one of these striking changes that even such a serious person can use the narrative patterns of the Superman type and so on, and can use something which uses all these cheap literary devices, but at the same time which in a way is highly intellectual and sophisticated. Okay, all the tetralogy develops or moves into the concept of parallel worlds. Okay, they in MIT, Massachusetts, they discover some time machine and they travel in time. So one of the effects is that they travel back to ancient Egypt and they teach the locals how to build up the pyramids. Okay, this kind of funny explanation. No local brains and so on, but MIT scholars from the 25th century simply changed the history. And the same is traveling back into future and so on. But the effect is that with each traveling time, the worlds multiply. So at the beginning of the tetralogy, you have just one world, our world we live in. But as you go on, you need to read and put down notes or again draw some patterns and so on to not to lose orientation, okay? Because you have to notice and recognize which world we are in. And this kind of concept of alternative worlds is again immensely striking and appealing, because with the arrival of populism and this kind of nationalism or patriotism, you have again in public discourse all this insistence there is just one truth, okay, that this is what they call the objective truth and so on. Well, here the rabbi tells us that all is relative and depends on the point of view and so on. And the same is again develops into broader and broader concepts. As I'm saying, as you can imagine, this concept of alternative worlds and alternative history is immensely interesting and productive for fiction. What if Hitler conquered Great Britain instead of he attempted to invade during the Second World War, and all of a sudden you can develop all these worlds? Or what if communism didn't lose, but if communism went on and this kind of stuff? And as I'm saying, the same is the growth and also the reading pleasure of fantasy, science fiction, crime novels, and so on. So we have liberal literature, we have so-called junk literature. The other segment is something which again existed under communists, when literature is supposed to be engaged, to participate in the ideological struggle, to move people, behave properly, and so on. Because of that, of course, the whole concept faded away completely in the post-communist times. No one wanted to touch politics in novels and so on. Forget about that. Interestingly enough, in recent, say, 5-7 years, it's recovering and re-emerging. We again have a relatively large segment of something you might call politically engaged literature. The reason is that the whole situation around us is just grotesque and bizarre enough that it simply invites writers, instead of creating some fictional worlds like the rabbi, just to quote reality which is around us. And perhaps the illustration, we have the Prime Minister who is a multi-billionaire. He is the third richest person in this country, okay? And this multi-billionaire and capitalist par excellence, he and his government is supported by the Communist Party, okay? The communists who should fight the capitalists, but they support him for some mysterious reason, okay? And this is something, again, which might work to sit down and put it into a novel. Of course, this type of political engagement literature has, again, two limits. First of all, it's very, say, up-to-date. It communicates very well recently, because we know what they mean, what they are talking about. It's all based just on simple allegories, okay? Instead of using the proper name of the Prime Minister, they put there some invented name, but you understand, okay? After 10 years, no one will understand and no one will care, of course. These novels are immensely contextually bounded, okay? And the second limit is obviously even more nothing for translations, okay? It's too local, so on. Last comment about this is that Czech literature for decades is just self-centered. We live, as you look at the 3D map, we live in sort of valley, in splendid isolation, mountains all around, and the flat land inside, okay? And that's why this isolation, the physical and also mental isolation, even in post-communist times, was the essential feeling. Forget about the rest of the world. We can travel as tourists to Croatia, Greece, or New York City, or whatever. But we live here and we care just for the locals. In 1990s, or in the first decade of the 21st century, there would be almost no novels being located anywhere else than Prague, or some villages around Prague, and so on. Just a local setting, local people, and so on. No foreigners or whatever. 1990s, we had here a fascinating minority of American expatriates. In 1990s, there were 40,000 Americans living here in Prague. But you don't have one novel from the Czech side which would try to approach such a topic. What does it mean to live in a country whose language you don't speak, and how it feels to live somewhere with the feeling I'll be the new Hemingway or Scott Fitzgerald, okay? Prague of the 90s being the Paris of the 20s, and all of these cheap things, okay? But to get back to the point, finally, this is changing. Finally, we have novels which are located, at least partially, into China, into the other Asian countries, into Africa, and so on. This also opened, of course, the novels for all these contemporary issues like migration crisis, like the crisis of the democratic system, corruption, and the other features. Okay, then we have the other segment, and I'm reaching the end, more or less, which I'll touch just one or two sentences. It's a segment you might call the easy reading. Okay, this kind of fiction. The key segment, the central segment, is something you might call mid-brow literature. It's something which is easy to read, but at the same time, it presents you serious issues. Well, this easy reading segment is the stuff which tells you that all is just a matter of having great job and money or great partner or whatever. Okay, literature, which mixes up on the one hand all these humorous approaches and so on, with the obvious targets. Czech mentality is an immensely plebeian mentality. We didn't have, say, in contrast to the Polish nation, we didn't have, say, aristocracy that we would approach with some sort of respect and so on. Being on the bottom is kind of natural feeling, and that's how also the topics that are ridiculed are based on such a mentality approach. It's the aristocrats and the generation. It's the priests, for instance, or religious people who are just funny and stupid because they believe in something like the God. Whoever saw the God? No one. So, it's laughable and ridiculous and so on. By the way, 85% of Czechs claim that not only they would be atheists, because to be an atheist, you need to spend at least 5 minutes of your life raising the question, is there a God or not, and reaching the negative answer. Czechs would consider this to be just waste of time to raise such a ridiculous question. Okay, that's this kind of stuff. And this kind of approach based on humor, based on ridiculing any type of different people. Of course, this type of literature is also very xenophobic because it ridicules people because of their appearance, because of being strangers or foreigners and so on. And that's how it also connects with a strong amount of nationalism. Okay, one part of this easy reading segment are these fake historical novels which are located in some medieval times, that they are supposed, or they won't use the history, just like this kind of scene to approach contemporary issues, to tell you how Czechs always were the best nation in Europe, the most courageous, the most intelligent, and so on. So it's this cheap use or abuse of history. And the last section, which remains, is something you might call fiction seeking new trends, okay, which is relatively small here, because this is trying to explain in the situation the book market works. It's difficult and almost impossible to succeed once you're trying to be experimental, okay, to write literature which in previous decades made it into books of history of literature and so on, to write some, to experiment with new forms, new themes and so on. These novels, something are published, but they are aimed at a very small elite, say, of university professors and few editors or critics or whatever. The problem is that this is the type of literature which is not anymore able and capable to reach even high school teachers. Okay. High school teachers were always able to understand what's going on. Now, unfortunately, the fact is that literature, teaching contemporary literature, disappeared from the curriculum of Czech high schools because you don't know as a teacher how to read it, how to teach it, because you don't read it. You're confused by that. And that's how we are back at the beginning. Literature presented in high schools is something like a museum tour. Okay. It's something which just exists in past and addresses some past issues, makes sense in connection with the classes of history or whatever. It's not serving students to tell them that it can approach even the recent issues and confusions and this kind of stuff. So the ending is kind of spiral or vicious circle. We came back to where we started. Okay, we have some same, or as I began with, we have a relatively large segment with thousands of books and so on. But at the same time, in contrast to the previous decades, literature is now truly a very minor and very isolated segment of something you might call the social energy. Okay. 30 years ago, to be a writer still meant something. If you put down a name like Milan Kundera, you didn't need to describe the name. These days, when a famous writer dies and you're publishing an obituary, you need to put down the first and last name, but also some sort of attribute, like the writer so-and-so died. Okay. So literature kind of disappeared from this world in the Czech context. I wish you that you're luckier than most Czech writers. That's the end of my talk, and now any responses, questions, inquiries, please.
I may have misunderstood you. Did you say, you may have just been, is 85% of Czech people atheists?
Yeah, or if it's explaining, they don't raise the whole issue. They don't care. For them, the non-existence of God is the automatic thing, and there is no need to inquire or to think about that and so on. And it's still kind of, because again, some say it's the result of the communist propaganda. But at the same time, consider Poland, the same communist country of the same propaganda type. And you have 90% of Polish people who are devoted Catholics. Okay, so it cannot be just mere communist propaganda. Here, it will require a deeper explanation. Here, the reason is that the historical reason again, that Czech nation is constructed artificially and very quickly after the construction of all these big European nations like the Brits, the French people, Germans, and so on. And as it happened in the 19th century, it was the collective national ideology which simply substituted and pushed away the religious collective identity. Okay, because all of a sudden, when you need the fear, when you need to belong somewhere, to have this feeling of collective sharing, why would you rely on this traditional and boring religious community? Once you can choose a trendy and much more easygoing national collective identity, okay, to find way into a religious sphere. It's demanding. As a Catholic, I have to handle the idea of the Trinity of the God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is kind of difficult. With nationalism, it is much easier because they told you Czech people are people who are happy, who love their nation, who love their countryside, and who have a future. And that is all. So you just jump in and join because it's not demanding at all.
There's a difference between faith, what you can't see, and civilization and government and society that you can see.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wonder what, I think there must be such an interesting effect of the absence of a tradition of the creative writing workshop here. I mean, I think because you're talking to a bunch of American writers, I think that the creative writing workshop serves as a kind of, I guess, a measurement for literature in the United States or something like that. And here, I mean, paradoxically, we're in a private school that happens to have this new manifestation of this in the Czech context. But how are you seeing that kind of affect the culture, the contemporary literary culture here?
Yeah. It's again kind of difficult and complex situation because I don't have time to explain this, but you can imagine that the situation is very different when you're writing a piece of fiction which deals just with issues which are in the air at the moment. Okay, you just refer to them, and you don't have to explain it and so on. And very different situation is this kind of burden of the past, which I mentioned just very briefly. Okay, the feeling that our lives and our recent situation is still determined by something down there, be it decades or even centuries ago. Okay, so that's, I mean, again, something which should go into a mentality and sociology and so on. Even different position, reaching again the topic of elementary schools and high schools, the overloading of the role of history in our local context. Even say, if you enter debates on social networks again, people try to ridicule their opponents by referring to some lack of historical knowledge. You don't know who was this 15th century priest, and that makes you an idiot, okay? So this kind of thing, okay, that we tend to explain anything just via the historical reasoning, okay? And that's something, you know, in this kind of burden of history, even the fact, again, that, say, to give the illustration, when the communists stepped in, they wanted to build up completely new worlds and new human beings and all these revolutionary concepts, okay? And because of that, they also I lost the point never mind. Sorry. Such a great idea, but at the same time it's over there. Sorry. Generally, just to respond to this quickly, here, as I'm saying, the argumentation is always wrapped in this historical stuff. Coming to before the COVID times, coming to Great Britain the last time, 1990, I showed that they developed something they call a new study programs. They call contemporary studies, okay, which is just the study of the recent, okay, no historical reasoning and so on. Just consider just the recent situation, okay. That's something one couldn't imagine here, okay. So that's this kind of difference.
What I was asking about was the idea of teaching writing,
yeah.
which doesn't have a big tradition here, but I think has a huge influence on
American. Yeah. Thank you for bringing me back. That is the point I was going to make. When the communists wanted to build up these new worlds, so one of the projects was also that they invited, that they made the action they called mail workers into literature. Okay, the idea that the best proletarian workers in factories should be the best poets and prose fiction writers. It happened in the 1950s, and there was a system that out of, say, a factory of 500 people, you choose or elected one person who is going to become the new factory poet. Instead of working, he would go around and write write some rhymes and so on. The funny thing was that these people wrote some poetry and prose fiction, but it didn't look like poetry and prose fiction of 1950s or 1940s or even the avant-garde of 1930s. It looked like 19th century poetry, because that's exactly the idea. What poetry or prose fiction is about, you get from this educational system, okay? The classics, things which worked, but they worked 150 years ago. So on, and there's no equilibrium, and we should develop it into the recent times.
Well, what about the power of the writers' union, the idea of a writers' union?
We have something like 10 of them here.
Well, I'm thinking before 89, especially.
Yeah. Okay, connects to, there's, right, please briefly to explain, okay. The tradition of literature here, there's the influence, the national revival I mentioned as the key process of constructing the nation of the 19th century is essentially based on literature. Because we didn't have any other elites, okay? There were no philosophers, professional politicians, sociologists. They were just the writers, okay? So they picked up writers to be the elite, like the writers and the composers or artists. It's again this nationalistic criteria, because with architecture, art, or music, there is no clear national boundary. If you're composing symphonies, it's hard to compose something like typical Italian symphonies or whatever. While with the language, it's clear. You're either using German language and then you're a German writer, or Czech language and then you're a Czech writer. Okay, and that was the tradition, starting or emerging in the 19th century, and then going on. Even all these political events of the 20th century were influenced heavily by the writers, be it the creation of independent Czechoslovakia after the end of the First World War, but be it also the response to the problematic situation after the Second World War. The Czechs had a problematic status because they didn't fight Hitler. They accepted the so-called protectorate, okay? They labeled it occupation, but we were in a way the part protected by the Nazis, the part of Europe protected by the Nazis monarchy. And all of a sudden, it's over, the war is over, and you have the notion of the guilt. Because we didn't fight like the Poles, losing millions of lives. We accepted, we assimilated. And how do you solve it? The writers step in and construct this collective imagination of the other past all full of thousands and millions of guerrilla fighters, partisans who killed the Nazis in all forests and meadows and so on, okay. So that was the tradition, okay, the hero of the writers. And it is trying to explain, all of a sudden, it is all gone and lost as we enter the post-communist phase. And there is just this kind of confusion how to respond. Okay? That's why also the writers' unions were always the key instrument with this political impact and so on. And the stereotype lives on. You want to be the member of the writers' union, and best, you want to be the chair of the writers' union. Okay? And because of that, there are new and new writers' unions which are created because they make you just vice chair of that one. That's not enough for you, so you go to separate and to build up your own. Which again brings in the problem that even if the state, the Ministry of Culture, is willing to consult things and to talk to the writers, they don't have any representatives, okay, because they would have to invite all these tens of writers union, and of course these people won't agree on anything, because each has different opinions and so on. So it's again this kind of bizarre situation of the laws with no chance or no awareness how to respond and how to behave in this new situation. Yes.
Is Slovakia a market for Czech culture or vice versa, or how strong is that division?
That's a good question. It's interesting, it works one way. Okay, Slovakia, it means always minor and let's use this word, also less developed. It is the country of agriculture and villages, while Czechia was more the country of cities and industrialization and so on. And because of that, this asymmetrical situation developed that, of course, the Czech culture and the Czech literature publishing industry is much more productive. And that's why Slovaks always read in Czech. Because even economically, it didn't make sense to translate the same thing into Czech and Slovak. Or the films, we were always used here to dubbing of films. Okay? No subtitles, but proper dubbing, and dubbing which was made as a piece of art, okay, which sometimes even improved the original films. And again, here you wouldn't do the two dubbings into Czech and Slovaks, but only one into Czech. The Slovaks, of course, didn't like the situation, but also for them it was still better to watch a film dubbed in Czech than to watch it in the English or German original. Okay. And this situation survived even nowadays. Okay. If you go to Bratislava, so in their bookstores, you have books in Slovak. And then quite a lot, hundreds of books in Czech as well. While here, in the whole Prague, you don't have one Slovak bookstore. And in most bookstores, you wouldn't find even one book in Slovak. Okay, so it's kind of asymmetrical one way. Yeah.
I remember in '89 when I first came here that when you watched TV news, for example, it would be in Czech and Slovak. And from what I recall, the Czechs had no problem transferring back and forth. Is that still the case, Emma, you think? I mean, do people understand and process
But I've
Slovak?
heard that my generation has a harder.
Has a harder
But
time.
I mean, there's a lot of Slovaks working here. I've had a lot of Slovak colleagues,
Yeah.
especially in the music,
Yeah.
people who are ambitious come here.
Right. First this way, and it's interesting for the younger generation. For us, Slovak was no foreign language, okay, because we didn't speak actively. But we perfectly understood passively, because as Richard was saying, it was all the public media were based on half and half proportion, okay. So printed newspapers just in Czech, but TV programs like broadcasting a soccer game, it would be always a Czech voice and a Slovak voice, half and half, okay. And that's why it's very interesting, even as I'm teaching, I used always to recommend some secondary literature in Slovak, okay. And for me it was like recommending them a book in Czech, okay, the same thing. And all of a sudden, there came the generational break, that they prefer to read it in English than in Slovak. Okay, the same what I feel with my youngest kids who are around 20 now. For them, it's easier to watch films in Spanish or English than in Slovak. Okay, so all of a sudden, something which is our language becomes for the next generation a completely foreign language. Okay.
Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you.